Hello, my name is Ben Stewart, and in this video we will be discussing stress and disease, and specifically the body's response to stress. Psychoneuroimmunology is the study of the interaction of consciousness, psycho, the brain and spinal cord, neuro, and the body's defenses against external infection and abnormal cell division, immunology. Psychoneuroimmunology assumes that all immune-related disease is multifactorial. The immune system is integrated with other physiological processes and is sensitive to changes in the central nervous system and endocrine functioning, such as those that accompany psychologic states. The nervous, endocrine, and immune systems communicate through the common use of signal molecules and their receptors, which in turn regulate the behavior of cells in each system during the stress challenge. The initiation of these mediators and pathways depend on whether the stressor is a perceived stressor, such as the fear of needles, or a real stressor, which is actual tissue injury from the injection. The fear of needles is an example of a perceived stressor. It does not cause actual tissue injury, but it does produce stress. Perceived stressors elicit an anticipatory response that usually begins in the limbic system of the brain. The limbic system of the brain is the portion of the brain that is involved in learning and memory. The limbic system activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which results in the release of cortisol. It also activates the sympathetic nervous system, which eventually results in the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine. Cortisol, epinephrine, and norepinephrine then modulate the body's responses to stress. An example of a real stressor is the pain and injury that occurs when receiving an injection. A real stressor elicits a reactive response that can begin either in the limbic system or in the brain in response to specific sensory information, such as pain or injury. This then starts the pathway that was talked about before. The limbic system, or the pathways that begin with sensory injury, can activate the hypothalamic pituitary axis and the sympathetic nervous system, resulting in the release of cortisol, epinephrine, norepinephrine, and the stress response. The sympathetic nervous system is aroused during the stress response, and it results in the adrenal gland medulla releasing catecholamines such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Catecholamines mimic sympathetic stimulation and have two main functions. The first is to mobilize energy stores for the flight and fight response, and basically to be able to gear up to have the energy to run fast or fight hard. Catecholamines also result in a temporary increase in T cytotoxic and natural killer cells. This increase lasts for less than 2 hours, unless the stressor is chronic. 80% of the catecholamines that are released by the adrenal medulla in response to the stress response is epinephrine. Epinephrine exerts its chief effects on the cardiovascular system. It increases cardiac output and increases blood flow to the heart, brain, and skeletal muscles by dilating vessels that supply these organs. It also dilates the airways, thereby increasing delivery of oxygen to the bloodstream. Epinephrine mainly binds the alpha and beta adrenergic receptors in its target tissues. Another function of epinephrine is that it prevents glucose from being taken up by peripheral tissue, which causes insulin resistance. The remaining 20% of catecholamines that are released by the adrenal medulla are norepinephrine. Norepinephrine promotes arousal, increased vigilance, increased anxiety, and increased alertness, among other protective emotional responses. Norepinephrine, in contrast to epinephrine, only binds to alpha adrenergic receptors. The chief effects of norepinephrine on the cardiac vascular system complements those of epinephrine. Norepinephrine constricts blood vessels of the viscera and skin. This has the effect of shifting blood flow to the vessels dilated by epinephrine. In addition, norepinephrine causes piloerection, which is also known as goosebumps. It results in dilation of the pupils of the eye and also increased sweating in the armpits and palms. In addition to the sympathetic nervous system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is also stimulated during the stress response. This is a complicated pathway that involves multiple hormones. It starts when the hypothalamus releases corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. CRH stimulates the pituitary to release adrenocorticotropin hormone, ACTH. Adrenocorticotropin hormone stimulates the adrenals to release cortisol, a glucocorticoid, which results in the stress response. Cortico-releasing hormones released by the hypothalamus stimulates the pituitary, both the anterior and posterior, to release a lot of other different hormones that modulate the stress response. In addition to stimulating the anterior and posterior pituitary to release hormones, corticotropin-releasing hormone has several physiological effects on its own. It is the hormone that the brain uses to activate both the sympathetic nervous system and also the rest of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So basically, it activates glucocorticoids such as cortisol and also all the catecholamines. It is also pro-inflammatory. It causes vasodilation and vascular permeability. Corticotropin-releasing hormone is released both in the hypothalamus of the brain and then peripherally at the inflammatory sites where injury has occurred. This is one of the mechanisms by which real stressors start the stress response by the release of corticotropin-releasing hormone. The major chemical mediator in the HPA axis is cortisol. Cortisol's chief effects involve metabolic processes. By inhibiting the use of metabolic substances while promoting their formation, cortisol mobilizes glucose, amino acids, lipids, and fatty acids and delivers them to the bloodstream. This results in the body's using the body resources in order to respond and adapt to the stressor. It redistributes proteins and fat tissues to make sure we have fuel we need to carry on the sustained stress response. Cortisol affects different tissues in different manners. For example, if it breaks down tissue in the lymphoid tissue, such as thymus, the spleen, and the lymph nodes. It increases protein and RNA synthesis in the liver, an anabolic effect. It stimulates gluconeogenesis and elevates the blood glucose level. Cortisol increases blood pressure and cardiac output. And then it promotes breakdown of protein, catabolysis, including muscle, bone, skin, and adipose tissue. Finally, cortisol promotes lipogenesis, in which fat is deposited in the abdomen, trunk, and face. Cortisol has a significant interaction with the immune system. It increases the levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, resulting in increased acute inflammation and allergic reactions. It also suppresses T helper 1 activity, which results in a decreased cellular immunity. Cortisol also stimulates T helper 2 activity, which enhances humoral immunity. Stress can influence the release of reproductive hormones. Stress suppresses the hypothalamic gonadotropin-releasing hormone, which stimulates the ovaries and testes to release their hormones. Basically, cortisol suppresses the release of luteinizing hormone, estradiol, and progesterone from the ovaries, and also testosterone from the testes. The HPA axis is also influenced by hormones from the ovaries. Estrogen stimulates the HPA axis, and leptin inhibits the HPA axis. Additional hormones that are influenced by stress that are released by the pituitary gland are prolactin, which increases during stress, and this affects lactation and breast development. Oxytocin has anti-stress and HPA axis properties, and then growth hormone counters the effects of insulin and enhances immunity. Additional mediators for stress include the neuropeptide Y. This is a sympathetic neurotransmitter that mediates stress. Then it is also a growth factor for many cells, and it can lead to atherosclerosis and tissue remodeling. There are some other hormones that can influence the stress and immune response. Some may suppress the immune response, others may enhance the response. The response is dependent upon the concentration and length of exposure to stress, the target cell of the hormone, and the specific immune function that is being evaluated. Endorphins and enkephalins are proteins in the brain that have pain-relieving capabilities. When these are released, the person experiences insensitivity to pain, increased feelings of excitement, a positive well-being, and euphoria. The theory behind this is that these proteins help withstand pain during the fight or flight response. This slide is a summary of the body's responses to stress. On the left side, you can see the sympathetic nervous system and its responses, and on the right side, you can see the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis and its responses. The important things to realize with the sympathetic nervous system is that it results in increased blood pressure, increased pupil dilation, goosebumps, increased cardiac output, and increased blood glucose. The HPA axis, which is mediated by cortisol, increases blood pressure and cardiac output and changes inflammatory and immune responses.